I'm sorry to plus, verb. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sorry to see you go. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm sorry to report this issue. I'm sorry to ask for your help. I'm sorry to admit my mistake. I'm sorry to inconvenience you. I'm sorry to have made you wait. I'm sorry to have to remind you. I'm sorry to have to remind you. I'm sorry to have to correct you. I'm sorry to hear you're leaving. I'm sorry to have to confront you. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. I'm sorry to trouble you with this. I'm sorry to hear about the mistake. I'm sorry to have to emphasize this. I'm sorry to hear about your illness. I'm sorry to hear about the accident. I'm sorry to hear about your breakup. I'm sorry to hear about your troubles. I'm sorry to hear about your job loss. I'm sorry to have to re-emphasize this. I'm sorry to have to cancel our plans. I'm sorry to hear you're feeling down. I'm sorry to have to cancel the event. I'm sorry to have to deliver bad news. I'm sorry to have caused any confusion. I'm sorry to have caused any confusion. I'm sorry to have to confront the issue. I'm sorry to have to mention this again. I'm sorry to have to revisit this topic. I'm sorry to have to pinpoint the issue. I'm sorry to have to clarify this point. I'm sorry to have to criticize your work. I'm sorry to have to criticize your work. I'm sorry to have to bring up this issue. I'm sorry to have to discuss this matter. I'm sorry to have to point out the error. I'm sorry to have to focus on this issue. I'm sorry to have to stress this concern. I'm sorry to hear about your flight delay. I'm sorry to hear about your lost luggage. I'm sorry to have to emphasize this again. I'm sorry to hear about your exam results. I'm sorry to hear you're not feeling well. I'm sorry to hear about your car accident. I'm sorry to hear about your broken heart. I'm sorry to have to reiterate this point. I'm sorry to have to underline this issue. I'm sorry to have to reject your proposal. I'm sorry to have to dwell on this matter. I'm sorry to hear about your car breakdown. I'm sorry to hear about your job interview. I'm sorry to hear about your job interview. I'm sorry to hear about your housing issue. I'm sorry to hear about your pet's illness. I'm sorry to hear about your failed project. I'm sorry to hear about your computer crash. I'm sorry to have to highlight this concern. I'm sorry to have to reschedule our meeting. I'm sorry to hear about your disappointment. I'm sorry to hear about your disappointment. I'm sorry to hear about your health problem. I'm sorry to have to draw attention to this. I'm sorry to hear about your family dispute. I'm sorry to hear about the misunderstanding. I'm sorry to have to decline your invitation. I'm sorry to hear you're facing difficulties. I'm sorry to hear you're facing difficulties. I'm sorry to hear about your project setback. I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your pet. I'm sorry to hear about your job termination. I'm sorry to hear about your financial strain. I'm sorry to hear about your financial crisis. I'm sorry to hear about your personal setback. I'm sorry to hear about your personal struggle. I'm sorry to hear about your financial setback. I'm sorry to have to critique your performance. I'm sorry to hear about your medical condition. I'm sorry to hear about your academic struggle. I'm sorry to hear about your missed opportunity. I'm sorry to hear about your missed opportunity. I'm sorry to hear about your financial troubles. I'm sorry to hear about your family's situation. I'm sorry to hear about your unexpected expense. I'm sorry to hear about your transportation issue. I'm sorry to hear about your travel inconvenience. I'm sorry to hear about your relationship problems. I'm sorry to hear about your relationship problems. I'm sorry to hear about your technical difficulties. I'm sorry to hear you're going through a tough time.